Imagine an apex predator that doesn't actually want to kill its prey.
Right, which sounds completely counterintuitive for a massive carnivore.
Exactly. Like, instead of going for the kill, it just runs up to a creature the size of a building, rips off a 50-pound chunk of flesh, and then just, retreats.
Treating a living, breathing animal like a walking, renewable buffet.
Yeah. It is a terrifying but honestly brilliant evolutionary strategy. And today we are talking about the dinosaur that actually did that, the Allosaurus.
It's an animal that completely challenges pretty much all our traditional assumptions about how the prehistoric world actually operated.
Because right now, if you walk into any natural history museum, there's almost always that one display that just completely commands the room, right? The Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Oh yeah, always front and center.
It stands there like the undisputed king, and it casts this massive, almost mythological shadow over the entire Mesozoic era. And because of that T-Rex shadow, we tend to view basically every other carnivorous dinosaur as just an understudy, a warm-up act.
Which is such a massive disservice to the actual timeline. I mean, we're looking at a predator that ruled the late Jurassic long before the T-Rex ever even existed. And from an engineering standpoint, it was arguably much more sophisticated.
Right, which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. So, welcome. We are looking at a really massive stack of source material for this one. We've got detailed encyclopedia entries, peer-reviewed scientific papers on cranial morphology, museum fossil data from Utah, some really intense Reddit community debates, and even the transcripts from a classic BBC documentary.
It's a really comprehensive pile of data.
It really is. And our mission for you today is to look past that pop culture shadow and uncover the true story of the Allosaurus. We want to show you a uniquely engineered, highly successful animal that lived a, honestly, shockingly brutal life. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to really understand how the Allosaurus lived and dominated, we actually first have to look at how humanity originally found it. And it's a story of incredible chaos. We kept getting its identity completely wrong for decades.
Yeah, it's a really messy origin story. It starts back in 1877 during what paleontologists call the Bone Wars.
Right, the infamous Bone Wars.
Yeah, this notoriously bitter feud between two rival American scientists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. They were essentially just racing to dig up the American West, and it was so competitive, they were sometimes literally dynamiting each other's dig sites just so the other guy couldn't get the bones.
Which is just a disastrous time for scientific rigor. I mean, in that chaotic rush to publish, Marsh described some fragmentary bones he found, and he named the creature Allosaurus, which in Greek actually translates to different lizard.
Which feels like a really strange name for a dinosaur. Like, why different? Different from what?
Well, he called it that because its vertebrae were uniquely lightweight. They had these hollow, sort of hourglass-shaped cavities that made them look incredibly fragile compared to the really heavy, dense bones of the other dinosaurs they were pulling out of the ground.
Oh, so that's why he named the main species Allosaurus fragilis.
Exactly. But because Marsh and Cope were just rushing so fast, the taxonomy, the actual naming and categorization of these animals became a total nightmare. For over 50 years, the Allosaurus was mistakenly known to the public and even to most scientists by a completely different name.
Antrodemus, right?
Right, Antrodemus. It wasn't until the mid-20th century when paleontologists started excavating these massive, unambiguous bone beds in Utah that the name Allosaurus was finally restored.
And once the dust finally settled on all that naming drama, we realized this wasn't just some isolated animal. It was a highly successful, widely distributed genus. Like, you have Allosaurus fragilis in North America, obviously. But then researchers uncovered Allosaurus europaeus all the way over in Portugal.
Which is an amazing find.
It totally blew my mind when I saw that in the encyclopedia data. Like, how does a dinosaur end up in both North America and Europe?
It proves that during the late Jurassic, there were land bridges or at least temporary connections allowing for intercontinental faunal exchange. Basically, these predators were literally walking between continents.
That is wild.
Yeah. And then we have an older, slightly different species in the fossil record called Allosaurus jimitseni.
Oh, I have to bring up the discovery story for jimitseni because it is just brilliant. So they found a skeleton in Dinosaur National Monument back in the early 1990s, but it was completely missing its head.
Right, the classic headless skeleton problem.
Exactly. They dug and dug for years, but there was no skull.
Yeah.
Then in 1996, this researcher named Ramal Jones goes out to the site, but he doesn't take a shovel. He takes a radiation detector.
Yeah, he used a device similar to a Geiger counter.
But wait, why would a dinosaur bone be radioactive? I was reading that in the notes and I couldn't quite put the pieces together.
So it has to do with the fossilization process itself. Over millions of years, as groundwater seeps through the rock and into the porous cavities of the buried bones, it deposits dissolved minerals.
Okay, so the minerals replace the bone.
Right. And in certain geological formations, that groundwater is carrying radioactive isotopes, like uranium. So the bone matrix is essentially replaced by these heavy, mildly radioactive metals.
Oh, wow. That makes perfect sense. So Jones is scanning this solid wall of rock, gets a massive radiation spike. They dig into the rock face, and boom, there's the perfectly preserved skull of the Allosaurus.
It's just incredible detective work.
It really is. But all this talk about different species brings up a huge point of contention that we saw in the Reddit threads we reviewed. A user was venting about a kid in their life who confidently claimed the Allosaurus was actually bigger than the T-Rex.
Yeah, I can definitely see why the Reddit user was frustrated there. Because if we are talking strictly about mass, which is the standard biological measure of size, the T-Rex was much, much heavier.
Right, not even close.
No, an adult T-Rex could weigh up to 10 tons. A typical adult Allosaurus fragilis weighed in around 1.5 to 2 tons. It is an entirely different weight class.
Well, I want to push back on that just slightly.
Right.
Based on a 2024 study by paleontologist Andy Dannison that we have in our stack, he reveals something that sort of shifts those numbers a bit.
Oh, the Oklahoma fossils.
Yeah. There are these fossils in Oklahoma of a supposedly distinct massive dinosaur called Saurophygonex. It's actually the official state fossil of Oklahoma. But Dannison's research proved that Saurophygonex wasn't a separate genus at all. It was actually a giant 40-foot, 5-ton species of Allosaurus, which he formally renamed Allosaurus NX.
That is a critical update to the taxonomy for sure. So while Allosaurus annex still doesn't outweigh a 10-ton T-Rex, it was absolutely massive, and it definitely rivaled the T-Rex in sheer length.
Right. But here's my struggle with this, though. Even if we completely ignore the giant 5-ton anomaly, just look at the standard 2-ton Allosaurus fragilis, the fossil record shows it made up 70 to 75% of all the predator fossils in its ecosystem.
Yeah, it was everywhere.
That is a total monopoly. If it wasn't this massive 10-ton bone-crushing tank like the T-Rex,
Yeah.
how did it achieve that level of dominance? Like, what was its mechanical advantage?
Yeah. What's fascinating here is that the Allosaurus proves sheer size and bulk aren't everything. It was an absolute evolutionary marvel of biomechanical engineering. To understand how a lighter predator dominated, we have to look really closely at its skull.
Yeah, the dimensions of its mouth are just staggering. The data shows it had a maximum gape of 92 degrees. It could basically unhinge its jaw.
It could open its mouth incredibly wide, yeah. But researchers ran into this bizarre contradiction when they studied how those jaws actually functioned. They used a technique called finite element analysis on digital models of the skull.
Finite element analysis, what is that?
It's a computerized method usually used by civil engineers. So they build a digital 3D model of, say, a bridge or a car, and they apply virtual stress to see where the structure bends or breaks.
Oh, neat. So they did that to a dinosaur skull.
Exactly. And when they did this to the Allosaurus, they found its muscle-driven bite force was actually relatively weak.
Wait, weak? How weak are we talking for a dinosaur?
It could only produce a bite force of about 800 to maybe 8,700 newtons. To put that in perspective, a modern alligator can bite down with way more force than that. A T-Rex, which could literally crush a car, operated in the tens of thousands of newtons.
Wait, okay, I'm completely lost. How does a dinosaur with a super wide mouth and a weak bite dominate an ecosystem filled with massive armored herbivores? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, the secret isn't in the jaw muscles at all. It's in the architecture of the bone. That same finite element analysis showed that while the bite force was weak, the skull itself was built like a reinforced titanium tank.
Really?
Yeah, the skull could withstand an incredible 55,500 newtons of vertical force without splintering or breaking.
So it has weak muscles, but a virtually indestructible head. How does it actually use that in a hunt?
We have a 2013 paper from Ohio University that answers exactly that. They used multi-body dynamics, which is software typically used to model robotics and complex machinery to simulate the head and neck movements of the Allosaurus compared to the T-Rex.
Okay, so comparing how they move.
Right. And the T-Rex hunted by grabbing prey and violently shaking its head from side to side, basically tearing flesh like a modern crocodile.
And to execute a side-to-side shake like that, the T-Rex would need a massive, heavily muscled neck.
Exactly. And a huge, heavy head means high rotational inertia. It takes a massive amount of energy just to start that side-to-side swing and just as much energy to stop it.
Oh, that makes sense.
But the Allosaurus had a very lightweight head and an incredibly flexible, highly muscled neck designed for a completely different motion. Instead of shaking side to side, the Allosaurus was engineered to open its mouth at full 92 degrees, drive its upper jaw straight down into its prey like a machete, and then pull straight up and back.
So it's using the power of its entire neck and body, not just its jaw muscles.
Exactly.
The Ohio University study compared the motion to a modern-day falcon stripping flesh from a carcass. And I really love the analogy the researchers used to explain the physics of this. They compared the two dinosaurs to figure skaters.
Ah, yes, the rotational inertia concept.
Right. So picture an ice skater. The T-Rex is a skater spinning on the ice with her arms fully extended, and she's holding a heavy bowling ball in each hand. It is incredibly hard to get that spin started, and it's really hard to stop. You have all this mass positioned far away from the center of gravity.
Right.
But the Allosaurus is the skater with her arms tucked in tight against her chest. She is agile, she is incredibly fast, and she has total precise control over her movements.
And that speed and precision allowed the Allosaurus to be a completely different kind of hunter. It didn't need to crush bone. It used this hatchet jaw technique to inflict massive, rapid trauma. And this actually leads us directly to that Flesh-Grazer hypothesis you mentioned at the beginning of our deep dive.
Yes, I read that in the sources, and it fundamentally changed how I view these animals. Let's dig into that, because it's a profound shift in how we think about predator-prey dynamics.
Well, the late Jurassic was filled with giant sauropods. You know, those long-necked, long-tailed herbivores like mythological and brachiosaurs.
Right, just absolute behemoths.
Exactly. These animals were moving mountains of meat. Some paleontologists suggest that instead of trying to kill these giants outright, which carries a huge risk of being crushed, and Allosaurus might just run up, use that wide gape and hatchet motion to take a massive bite of flesh right out of the living sauropod and then just retreat.
I mean, from an ecological standpoint, that is a brilliant insight into sustainability. By treating the sauropods as a renewable resource rather than trying to kill them, the Allosaurus maximizes its calorie intake while minimizing its risk of a fatal encounter. The sauropod eventually heals, and the predator gets to eat again another day.
Exactly. It's horrifying, but incredibly efficient.
But even with that strategy, being a fast, lightweight contact predator that throws its face into giant, thrashing herbivores comes with a severe cost.
Uh-huh.
The fossil record of the Allosaurus basically reads like an emergency room chart.
Oh, it really does. It is staggering how much trauma these animals sustained. Because they were constantly grappling with massive prey, their skeletons are absolutely riddled with bone pathologies. We find healed rib fractures, shattered shoulder blades, and arms completely littered with stress fractures.
Yeah, I noticed that detail about the arms. Unlike the T-Rex with its tiny little two fingers, the Allosaurus had relatively long, really powerful arms equipped with three massive, hook-shaped claws.
Right, they were grapplers.
Yeah, they used those arms to physically latch onto their prey. And the sheer kinetic stress of holding onto a bucking multi-ton animal literally fractured their hand and arm bones on a regular basis.
And we know the prey fought back hard. There is one highly documented Allosaurus pelvis fossil that features a massive gaping puncture wound. And when researchers examined the shape and diameter of that hole, it perfectly matched the tail spike of a stegosaurus.
A stegosaurus spike right through the pelvis. I mean, you can't even imagine the pain of that. But if you really want to understand the true, tragic reality of living as an Allosaurus, we have to talk about the fossil known as Big Al.
Oh, Big Al. Such a sad story.
It really is. This was a 95% complete skeleton found in Wyoming. It represents a subadult, so maybe 87% fully grown, about 26 feet long. Big Al was featured in a BBC documentary back in the year 2000, and his skeleton is basically just a map of misery.
Yeah, the pathologies on Big Al paint a very clear, sequential picture of his life. The evidence shows that Al suffered a severe injury to his left foot early on, and to compensate for the pain of that injury, he had to put all of his weight on his right foot as he moved.
Which is a completely natural biological response, right?
Yeah.
It's exactly what humans do when we sprain an ankle. We limp and we put all the stress on our good leg.
Right, and because of that constant overcompensation, Al eventually tripped or stumbled and broke his right middle toe. And that broken toe did not heal cleanly. It developed a raging massive bone infection. When you look at the fossil, you can actually see the explosive, distorted, kind of cauliflower-like bone growth on that toe. The swelling and agony would have been just debilitating.
So with a shattered, infected right toe and a bad left foot, Al basically lost his mobility.
Hmm.
And if a contact predator can't run, it can't hunt.
Exactly. The analysis suggests he eventually died of thirst and starvation in a dried-up riverbed, which is exactly where his body was preserved.
When I was reviewing this, it struck me how relatable it makes this 150-million-year-old monster. Like, this apex predator wasn't brought down in some epic clash of titans. It was brought down because it tripped on a log, stubbed its toe, and got a bacterial infection.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these injuries actually prove a vital point about their overall biology. I mean, yes, Big Al died from his injuries, but the vast majority of the Allosaurus fossils we find show healed fractures and healed bone infections.
Meaning they survived the trauma. They fought off those infections.
Precisely. It demonstrates that they possessed an astonishing biological resilience. They endured immense chronic pain, and their bodies healed rapidly enough to allow them to keep hunting.
But all of these severe injuries raise a huge question about their ecology. If they were constantly battered, limping around breaking bones, did they cooperate to survive? Like, were they solitary killers, or did they rely on a pack? Because we have to talk about the Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry in Utah.
Right, that site is incredible.
It is this massive, chaotic jumble of dinosaur bones. At least 73 individual dinosaurs have been pulled from this mudstone, and roughly 66% of them are Allosaurus fragilis. Dozens of them, all buried together in the exact same spot.
And the traditional pop culture view, which you definitely still see in older literature and kids' books, is that finding so many predators together implies cooperative pack hunting. The idea was that they teamed up, sort of like a pack of wolves, to take down giant sauropods.
I always love that image. But the modern consensus in our sources pushes back on it pretty hard. Why are scientists moving away from the whole pack hunter theory?
This raises an important question about how we interpret the past. We have a very bad habit of projecting mammalian social traits like wolf packs or lion prides onto dinosaurs. But if you look at modern diapsids,
Diapsids.
right, the diapsids are a specific evolutionary lineage of reptiles characterized by having two holes in their skull behind the eye. It includes modern crocodiles, Komodo dragons, and birds.
Okay.
Yeah, they are the closest living behavioral analogs we have to non-avian dinosaurs. And modern crocodilians or large lizards rarely, if ever, cooperate in a mammalian sense. They are highly territorial and violently competitive.
Okay, so if they weren't working together as a pack, why are dozens of them buried in the exact same spot in Utah?
The data actually points toward the quarry being a predator trap or maybe a drought congregation. So picture a drying watering hole during a severe Jurassic drought. Herbivores come to drink, they get stuck in the thick, sticky mud, and they die.
Okay, setting the bait, basically.
Right. The smell of rotting meat drifts across the floodplain and attracts an Allosaurus. It wades in to scavenge the carcass, gets stuck in the mud itself, and dies. Then the smell of that meat attracts another Allosaurus.
Oh my God, it's a deadly chain reaction.
Okay.
Just a conveyor belt of scavengers getting stuck. And the fossil evidence gets even darker than that. The researchers found Allosaurus teeth marks scraped deeply across other Allosaurus bones, and shed Allosaurus teeth mixed right in with the remains of their own kind.
Yeah, it's pretty grim.
It wasn't a coordinated pack sharing a family meal. It was a brutal, chaotic feeding frenzy. If you were weak or stuck in the mud, your own species wouldn't hesitate to just eat you alive.
It is a starkly different picture of their social behavior, for sure. However, it is worth noting that they did have highly distinct life stages, which might explain how so many of them survived to adulthood without just eating each other first. Researchers performed histological analysis on their bones.
Oh, that's where they slice the fossilized bone paper thin and look at the microscopic structure.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a lot like looking at tree rings to see how fast the tissue is laid down. And the histology shows that they grew incredibly rapidly during their juvenile years, much like modern birds do. But the young Allosaurus were anatomically different from the adults. They had much longer legs relative to their body size.
So the teenagers were built for pure speed.
Yes, exactly.
They were likely chasing down small, fast prey, staying completely out of the way of the slower, bulkier adults. And then, as they reached maturity, their legs thickened up, their bodies gained mass, and they transitioned into those heavy, hatchet-jaw ambush predators.
Right, they completely adapted their ecological niche as they aged, which minimized competition between the juveniles and the adults.
Which clearly worked perfectly for them. I mean, there is a deep irony in Marsh naming it the different lizard because its bones looked fragile. Because based on the fossil record, it was actually the most common theropod of its entire era. It outnumbered its rival predators, like the massive Torvosaurus, by an astonishing ratio of 11 to 1. It was absolutely everywhere.
It was the undisputed ruler of the late Jurassic.
The narrative of the Allosaurus is just incredible. I mean, we started with the chaotic dynamite explosions of the Bone Wars and the mystery of radioactive skulls. We stripped away the T-Rex comparison to find a precision-engineered predator that used multibody dynamics and rotational inertia to hatchet its prey or, sustainably harvest flesh from living giants.
Yeah, quite the resume.
And we saw the intense vulnerability in Big Al's infected toe and the brutal reality of the cannibalistic predator traps in Utah. It is a wildly different paradigm from what most people imagine.
It really is. But before we finish up today, there's one detail buried in the CT scan data that completely changes how you visualize this animal in its environment. Throughout this deep dive, we've talked about what the Allosaurus looked like, how its muscles attached, and how it fought. But we haven't actually talked about what it heard.
Oh, right. I was looking at those scans of the brain cavities in the source material, but I couldn't quite wrap my head around the shape of the inner ear. What exactly were researchers looking at there?
Well, by digitally reconstructing the space where the inner ear rested inside the skull, researchers realized that their hearing was adapted almost exclusively for low-frequency sound waves.
Interesting. What does that mean for how it experienced the world, practically speaking?
It means an Allosaurus would have a very hard time hearing subtle, high-pitched noises. If a small mammal scurried through the brush or a dry twig snapped underfoot right nearby, the Allosaurus likely wouldn't register the sound at all.
Wow, really?
Yeah, but that inner ear was perfectly engineered to feel and hear the deep, low-frequency rumbles of massive sauropod herds moving across the floodplain from miles and miles away.
That is such a cinematic detail. I want you to picture this. Imagine you are standing perfectly still in a dense, humid Jurassic forest. An Allosaurus stalks into the clearing right in front of you. It is 30 feet long, covered in scars, its three-fingered claws twitching. You hold your breath. You're terrified you might shift your weight, step on a branch, and give yourself away.
A terrifying scenario.
But the reality is, it probably wouldn't even hear your footsteps, because its brain isn't listening for you. It is completely tuned in to the rhythmic, earthquake-like thuds of the walking meat mountains it calls dinner. To this apex predator, you aren't even on the radar. You are just a ghost in its world.
It is a chilling, beautiful realization of just how specialized and focused they were on their specific environment.
It changes everything. It proves that the Allosaurus was never just an understudy waiting in the wings for the T-Rex to arrive millions of years later. It was a completely different kind of monster, perfectly engineered for its own brutal, rumbling world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and stay curious.